So, okay. What do you think? Ikigai equal kind of a passion. What do you think?
So I think Ikigai and Yarigai. Ikigai being your reason for being, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Yarigai is kind of what makes you happy and what makes you get up in the morning and want to do it, and kind of what's that drive that you have. There's a special part of me that feels like I really want to help Japan.
Hi Ryan, thank you so much for being here. How are you in Tokyo?
Good, thank you, Kaori. It's good to see you. And
So 2 weeks ago, no, I and Yuki Shirato, the managing director at Techstars Tokyo, we had startup event and discuss about how can we improve the startup ecosystem in Japan. And then you helped us, right? So please introduce about yourself. Ryan, what do you do in Tokyo?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Ryan Hart. I've been involved with Techstars now for a number of years. Initially, I started with Techstars in Boulder, Colorado, which is where Techstars originally got founded.
Yeah, so Colorado, I haven't been to there yet, but I hear they have good startup ecosystem. Okay, let's talk about your company. So you have your own company, right? So tell us about what does your company do and why did you start?
Sure. So this is actually my third company.
Third company?
Yeah. So actually, what I do now is interim fractional leadership. So it's a management consulting company. My background is in management consulting. I used to work here in Japan with PwC in Japan, where I was leading their customer experience management consulting practice. There are clients that are looking to transform themselves around the customer. So that could be data management, feedback management, innovation in tech, strategies to improve their relationships with their customers and have a better understanding of.
I come from New York, and at the time, so I was MasterCard New York office, and then I learned the new word for me, CX, customer experience, and employee experience, maybe EX. So kind of a similar idea.
Yes. So I think it's almost. So there was a big boom in the U.S. for the last probably 7 to 10 years around CX or customer experience, and a lot of people were thinking everyone needs to be customer-centric and everyone needs to have a really great experience for their customers. And I think that's still really important. But as the world tightened and markets became really difficult in financial services, I think what you see is there's more of a focus now on tech platforms or DX, especially in Japan, which is the digital transformation piece or digital experience, depending on how you look at it. But I think, Kaori, you probably know that some of the digital experiences in Japan are quite difficult and quite clunky compared to how you would see in the U.S. or in other markets. So how do you think as a UX designer? What do you think about that?
Good question. For instance, okay, so if we want to go to Kyoto from Tokyo, but maybe buying Shinkansen, like bullet train ticket, is kind of complicated, I think. Not only bullet train, transportation card, we have to go to the ticket machine, right? And this doesn't accept credit card, I think. And then maybe still we cannot buy train ticket by online, I think. And they have kind of like a screen, this station, beep beep, but their UI is kind of messy. Even for Japanese, it's difficult. Yeah, so this is a clunky. And also inside of a company, Japan has still, where we have to get approved from boss, like Hanko culture, like stamp, beep, beep, beep. Yeah, so still Japan is little by little, like step by step to adapt DX, I think.
Yes, unfortunately, I mean that's the opportunity in Japan, but it's also the challenge. I feel like they could do a lot better job of creating an easier customer experience and user experience through better design and better thought I think the idea of service design or ability to have a relationship with the technology throughout the customer journey, I think there's still new thinking for Japan.
So the reason why you started to your company because of previous big corporate. So you found a pain point.
I mean, it's a mindset also. I mean, just having a mindset that it's okay to fail and it's okay to try and experiment. And so it's very difficult to decouple the idea, okay, we're doing a large transformation, maybe digital platform implementation, but what we need to think about is, okay, what change management do we need to get people to think different and adopt a new technology and upskill the employees? And so there's just so many elements to digital transformation or even a cultural transformation that I think it's very difficult to do alone. So you need partners, and I think that's also why I'm trying to stay involved as much as possible in the startup ecosystem in the community here in Japan and other places, so that we can leverage other smart people that have very nimble and agile skills that we can plug in for different elements and parts of the transformation to accelerate or help catalyze the change.
Yeah, interesting. So maybe it was my bias. US people, Japanese people, different culture. Japanese people, we have perfection. We super afraid failure. That's why not only traditional Japanese company, even like me or my parents or normal people, we don't want to do stand out. Like we want to be average. This is the kind of Japanese mindset. Are we normal? Okay, I feel safe, right? That's why, like we couldn't make unicorn company. So sorry. In the States, there are many startups, Google, Ubers, but Japan couldn't make it because of a mindset difference. So, but that's why I was surprised. You said your customers global and also States, they didn't have just do it mindset.
So I mean, the idea is that you want to de-risk that as much as possible, and some companies have more risk appetite than others. I'm very cognizant of Japanese companies and how you need to approach it very differently. But I think if you provide a phased approach, and then actually over time you reach milestones, and you can constantly incorporate customer feedback to evolve and iterate your product or service, I think there's a lot of ways that you can do that. Lower risk, or at least chance that you might fail. I think it's always good to start with a really bold, ambitious goal and vision, like going to the moon, and then you work backwards from there, as opposed to starting really small and thinking, okay, well, we just want to do a payment system, and then we want to do this, and because you'll never get to to Bitcoin, for example, if you do that. So it's always good to, I feel like, to set out on a really bold vision and then work backwards to what's more realistic that way. And one of the best things that a company can be is agile and nimble enough to pivot when you have, and realize that you have to pivot, and then do it in a successful and a very conscious way.
Yeah, pivoting is so important. Not only business, even our life, So I used to really love living in New York. I don't want to live in the other state. But many things happen in 2023, and I had to pivot, plan B, plan C, plan. Because of sticking only plan A is always I am unhappy, right? Oh, why I cannot be in New York like that. Right. Anyway, pivoting, and then kind of life design, design thinking method. And then I found like a kind of what can I say? Raison d'être, it's French. Like the reason of my life. This is a podcast,
it's like
right?
Ikigai, right?
Yes.
Yes. So, we're in Japan, so maybe we should talk about Ikigai. Well, it's interesting. I met with an executive recently, and they asked me a very interesting question. They said, "Well, what would your Ikigai be, Ryan?" And I said, and I thought about it for a second, but almost I didn't really have to think. I knew right away that I would think my Ikigai is change. Reason it's woven throughout my life. I mean, I'm always moving around. I'm always changing kind of career paths and clients and kind of my focus, and always learning. I feel like change is always what kind of keeps me really excited and vibrant. I think that's also why I like consulting. But I think if people get an idea and they understand what is their Ikigai or their reason for being, I think a lot of other things in their life can become a lot clearer. And so I think that's a really that's a good segue that you introduced there when you were talking about you had that similar experience, Kaori, about what your kind of your reason for living or being is.
So, okay. What do you think? Ikigai equal kind of a passion? What do you think?
So I think Ikigai and Yarigai. Yeah. So Ikigai being your reason for being, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Yarigai is kind of what makes you happy and what makes you get up in the morning and want to do it, and kind of what's that drive that you have. So I feel like if your Ikigai is maybe about change, then maybe your Yarigai is about you always want to be changing and helping people change for good, or you want to be helping the world be a better place through your efforts around sustainability, for example. And so that maybe that gets people, even when it's dark and rainy and cold outside, you say, I want to get up and I want to help someone today. Yeah.
What is your Ikigai currently?
Well, I feel like there's a special part of me that feels like I really want to help Japan. I feel like in a lot of ways I look at Japan compared to a lot of other markets around the world that it's, in some ways, it's okureteru, or like it's slow to evolve, to adopt digital technologies. It's slow to transform around the customer. It's slow to kind of adopt innovative ways of thinking and working. And so I feel like if there's anyone that might be able to help accelerate, or help Japanese companies transform a little bit faster or be a little bit more customer-centric, I feel like maybe I'm in a better position to do that than other people, just because I've lived here for a long time and I speak Japanese and I know the kind of the nuances of doing business in Japan.
Yeah. So this is your like a kind of new restart, living in Japan. So super exciting. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Ryan. Yep.
Thank you very much, Kaori.
Bye bye. The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Ryan Hart. 1. Bridging the gap between tech and customer-centric innovation. Ryan emphasized that many tech-first founders, both in Japan and globally, often overlook the importance of customer experience. His consulting work helps companies shift from purely product-driven approaches to customer-centered strategies. For example, while Japanese startups might excel in developing advanced technologies, they sometimes struggle to identify who their ideal customers are. Ryan helps companies like these leverage data and customer feedback to create products people generally love and recommended. 2. The power of mindset driving transformation. Ryan discusses how cultural mindset, especially in Japan, how hinder innovation due to a strong fear of failure and preference for perfection. For example, traditional Japanese companies may hesitate to adopt new digital tools because they fear making mistakes. Ryan encourages these businesses to embrace an agile, experimental mindset, setting bold goals, like going to the moon, and then working backward, allowing room for trial, error, and growth without the pressure of perfection from the start. 3. Finding Ikigai through change and impact. Both Ryan and Kaori reflect on the concept of Ikigai, the reason for being, and how it shapes their personal and professional journeys. For Ryan, his Ikigai is rooted in embracing change and helping Japanese companies accelerate digital transformation. For example, after living in Japan for 15 years and understanding the unique challenges local business face, he is passionate about supporting companies that are slow to adopt customer-centric approaches, helping them thrive in competitive global market. Thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this episode will help your future and career. If you like this episode, please give you a like and subscribe it. Okay, thank you. Bye bye. またね。